What's good, football gamers? It's your boy Fen checking in with another College Football 25 YouTube video, and it's the one you've been waiting for. This will be the most complete and comprehensive guide to get you the best results in Dynasty mode recruiting that you've ever seen before. And I know it's a big claim as there's tons of great content around recruiting already, and we ourselves have done tons of videos on the subject as well, but I said what I said, this is the best one. It's the culmination of everything I've learned in 200 hours on the game mode between early access and then the full release, plus all the time spent planning for content and researching for videos on this channel, all put together. It's truly my magnum opus on recruiting, and we'll cover everything that we went over in half of a dozen videos plus more. We went over how to boost your coach and score 2 top 5 recruiting classes to unlock the elite recruiter branch in another video, and there is a way to cheese it, but importantly, that's not the goal of the video here today. Scoring a top class is more about quantity than quality. They reward you for having filled out all 35 of your scholarships, and as we're going to see here in a second, that's not actually as many people as we want to bring to town every year. More on that in a second, but just keep it in mind. We don't really have much time to waste as there's a ton to get to here, so I'm going to try to keep this first part a little shorter than usual. Remember that you're going to have to translate some of what we talk about here to what it looks like for your school, so I'm going to give a range of outcomes depending on where you're at, so this should be useful for everybody. So we're not talking about how to recruit at a specific size school, but rather concepts that'll work for you no matter where your program is. More recruiting hours in a bigger school obviously make things much easier. Less hours at a developing school are going to make things more challenging, but there will be something here for everybody. Part of the beauty of recruiting is that it can be different strokes for different folks, as they say. So while I'm not going to tell you that this is the only way to go about recruiting, I am going to go so far as to tell you that it's the best way. So lock in and open up that notes app if you want to, because it's time to hop right in with some fundamentals for planning out your best recruiting year in College Football 25. Hope you enjoy. To start to plan out your strategy for the year, start by setting your own guidelines for how many years you want your players to stay in the program in the first place. I would advise the full 5 years by redshirting all of your freshmen who aren't going to start for you, which should be the majority of them. This intended career length number will indicate how many prospects you should actually be targeting to bring to town every year. There's been a ton of questions around filling your board or not, or how many prospects is the right number to target, and it turns out there's just a correct answer to this question, and some pretty quick math can give it to us. We're limited to 85 players on our rosters before we start each season, so you'll have to cut athletes to get down to that number if you wind up with too many. So there is such a thing as recruiting too many bodies. Say, for example, you landed your full allotment of 35 recruits every year for even 4 years straight, and not the 5 with the red shirts that we've been talking about. You'd have 140 football players on your team, and you would need to cut 55 of them. Even 3 years in, you would have brought on 105 guys at your max scholarship capacity, and you'd have to cut at least 20. So I'm here to tell you pretty much right away that 35 players is way too many to bring to campus every year, and you should in no way intend to fill every single one of those spots. That doesn't mean we won't start with a full board, but we're going to get to that in just a second here, but some quick math on how to think about how many players you want to wind up with. If you're like me and you want your average player to stay for the 5 years in your program, we can just divide our roster cap of 85 by those 5 years to see how many players per year would keep you at 85 with no cuts, just perfect 85 every time. And it's not a tough equation here. The answer is 17 players. 17 players for 5 years produces 85 players. Transfers or early NFL draft declarations can't really be forecasted that well, but those will obviously subtract from our average numbers when they do happen. But as far as impacting larger year-to-year trends, in many cases, it's not going to move the needle all that much, so we'll keep it in the back of our mind for now. So if 17 players for 5 years creates our perfect 85 roster number, but we know that sometimes we'll have to start a freshman or graduate someone early and we're not going to get the full 5 years, you obviously have clearance to sign a couple more guys than that, no question. We also know that you can have a handful less than 85 if you want, so I'm calling your correct range of recruits that you actually land and not just target to be 15 to 20 guys. That's where we want to wind up, but you shouldn't plan to go 17 for 17 every year, so let's get into setting up your board in the first place with that in mind. We just want to wind up with 15 to 20 guys by the time all is said and done, but we are going to start with a full board and go from there. Let's keep it moving. Now that we know where we're going, our first order of business is to decide which star level will be your home base, or where you'll be able to land prospects the most frequently, and which will be your reach level, or the star caliber that you have a chance at but might be a little underpowered to land consistently. For the rest of the video, I'm going to refer to these two separate groups as your reach caliber prospects and your base caliber prospects. You can find out your range of realistically available guys on the recommended tab just by sorting by stars a couple times to see your low end and your high end prospects respectively. Before we do anything else, understand that the goal is to add players you feel like you have a realistic chance at landing, and you can tell this pretty much right away. Your priority, especially as a developing program, is to never waste hours on guys you don't wind up signing. The quality of your classes will be directly correlated to waste, with the higher amount of hours you light on fire every year by spending them on prospects you don't land, reducing the quality of the class that you can bring in. This is going to make for some tough decisions in removing prospects you might really love, but you know right off top you have an extremely low chance to land. I'll generally advocate, especially for low star programs, for less risk in taking higher percentage shots. Things like added recruiter skills that give you more hours or influence gain per prospect can swing balance in your favor even if you're the underdog, but I'm not going to assume any help at all. So we'll be strategizing as though you only had the default 50 hours, and here I can explain how you're able to predict your odds of success literally right away. We did a more thorough explanation of this particular idea in the video on predicting recruiting, but I'm going to give you the crash course right here. It's all about reading your pipeline tier and your influence bar as it compares to other schools on their list and their pipeline tiers and influence bars. We used this analogy before and I think it was helpful. You could think of the recruiting process like a race and the pipeline tier as your engine. The bigger engine, the more powerful your recruiting vehicle is. If you have both a lead in the race in the form of influence and a bigger engine powering your car in the form of the pipeline tier, as long as you keep your foot on the gas, you're never going to get caught, and that's the idea. So when we go to your reach star level filter, we'll sort by interest and pipeline to both add players who want to play for us based on our interest status and players we'll have the best advantages with due to our pipeline tier. Don't overthink this part too much, as we're going to remove some guys from our board before we do anything else at all. Fill your initial board starting with your reach level's top interest and top pipeline prospects. Think like 10 or so guys at the reach level, but probably not all too much more than that. Then you'll do the same thing with your base star level, or the guys you're seeing the most of in recommended and seem to be your general wheelhouse. There will be far more of these base guys than reach guys. Fill out the rest of your board with that basic strategy until you have your 35 targets. Call it 10 reach and the rest base or lower. We already know we don't need all of them, so now it's time to refine the board. Now it's time to refine your board, and I've done this next phase a couple of different ways, but this is where I've landed as the best way to do it, and I'll give you a couple important numbers to remember here as well. Offering 35 recruits a scholarship will cost you 175 hours, and you do generally want to leave this scholarship and scouting phase with all 35 of your offers out, so make sure you leave the necessary hours so you can do so. This is where you can go ahead and get your scout on. If you've done it the way I've suggested, your reach prospects with high interest or pipeline tiers will be on top of your board already, followed by your base level guys with the same advantages. So you can literally just start from the top in this case and scout everyone you can while still keeping that 175 hour bank to make sure they can get scholarships before you advance weeks. Just having a scholarship offer alone will gain you some influence to the tune of about 2 interests revealed, so it's worth it to make sure you've left enough hours, but scouting first does give you the advantage of identifying busts before spending on their scholarship offer. This can be on a case-to-case basis, but generally speaking, I will sometimes leave reach caliber busts on my board with potential lower hour investment, and will more often completely remove base level busts as they're basically going to play a star level lower than what they're showing for with bad dev traits and the like. You obviously want to leave this phase with all of your hours spent, so if you have a couple less than 35 prospects, it's not the end of the world, as you know you can't fit about half of these guys on the team by the numbers annually anyway. But before we move on, I want to make sure you hear me out on this, as it's somehow a hot take and it absolutely shouldn't be. This is the only time in the season that you should be scouting. Even huge schools with tons of hours would always be better served allocating those hours to recruiting actions to make sure you're actually landing guys in the first place. You just don't wind up with enough time. The worthwhile guys make their decisions much earlier. So treat scouting as a complete luxury to be spent when you literally have nothing better to spend on, but you almost always will. 5-star type of programs with over 1,000 hours are the only ones who I would even hear an argument in favor of scouting on. Otherwise, you can absolutely not afford those hours in exchange for information. You want to be exchanging hours for players when time is at a premium. And if you do this next part right, it's always going to be. Just before we get into the management of the board you have set up now, it's crucial to understand how the phases of recruiting work and what they tell you about essentially how much time you have left to close a prospect, because it's a huge part of how you'll wind up deciding how to move hours around and prioritize some guys over others. You have to really get a grip on how the cutoffs work to be able to make the best calls. So you might be showing for third place for a top 8 phase guy and have almost no shot at landing him, and by the same token, you might not be even on the board of someone you could absolutely land with the right strategy. With what you know about pipeline tiers and how they act like a multiplier, you'll be able to make your reads based on who's ahead of you and whether or not you think you could catch them. If you have a higher pipeline tier, you might be able to. If you have a lower one and an influence disadvantage, you probably can't. And although nothing's impossible, it's just going to wind up being a bad gamble to take. The phases are open, where they haven't made any cuts at all or locked anybody out. Then top 8, where all but 8 schools get locked out of further recruiting actions. Then top 5, where a few things happen. At the top 5 phase, the options to schedule a visit, hard or soft sell a prospect, or sway an interest open up for you. We're gonna go over those in just a second, but afterwards comes finally the top 3 phase, at which point the bars represent their progress toward their ultimate commitment decision. Now, I've heard some great information on phases and some really bad info about it as well, particularly about the influence bars and how they change between phases. And this is the best way I could think to explain it. The bars don't reset between phases as much as they rescale. So hours you spent to get to the current phase are still going to be reflected in the progress bars you'll see once the phase updates. But the bars are relative to the completion of that phase. A full bar only represents the end of that part of their recruiting. The coolest thing I've learned about phases is you can kind of handle them 2 very different ways. One way is you could kind of just brute force prospects through their decision phases. Since the bars don't reset, it's not like you can overshoot a phase until they're in their top 3, at which point a full bar represents their decision. Otherwise, any overage from one phase to the next is going to be reflected when the bars rescale to reflect the current phase's progress to completion. The other way of thinking about phases is just using them to bide your time. In this case, literally in the form of your hours, and decide whether you can actually afford to pull some back and reallocate them to more urgent phase situations, as it doesn't seem like anyone is making a serious run at pushing the phase like we would in the brute force phasing method. If someone else is leading and thus they're pushing the phase, you have to decide whether you're in a position to both make the cutoff and actually compete for the prospect later on if you do. So if you're going to let another team be the one to push phase, you should make sure you have something like a pipeline tier more powerful than theirs, or some type of recruiting skill trick up your sleeve that makes you feel like you can recover the deficit. But if they have the lead and a better pipeline and you don't have anything up your sleeve to overpower them, you're fighting a losing battle, and you can spare yourself the waste and just focus elsewhere. At the top 5 phase, you'll have some new options on ways to interact with recruits that we're going to talk about here. I'm going to start this segment with probably my hottest take potentially all video, but I don't think it should be, so let me explain myself first. Time is of the essence in a few different ways in recruiting. It's not just that your hours are limited, and they are, but you'll also have a limited number of weeks to land your guys before somebody else does. So I don't say this lightly, and I have absolutely done it both ways, but I'm just going to come out with it. I don't don't actually think scheduling visits is worth it in about 95% of cases. As always, if you have thousands of hours to spend, this might not apply to you, but if you don't, and most of our teams won't, visits just don't give enough advantages in the face of their potential disadvantages in ways that you could waste those 40 hours. Visits might give you influence later, and we would rather get influence now. That's for one thing. For another, you're only getting truly max benefit from a potential visit against higher tier teams, which are games you might lose, for one, but even if you know that you won't, these sorts of games aren't on the schedule all that often. The potential to waste hours on a visit by scheduling one and having them commit before it happens, or wasting by visiting on a losing week, or wasting by pitching on a school grade that stinks, or maybe you just had to guess at a pitch in the first place, the potential for waste is just too high to make this a reliable mechanic for me. And like we've been talking about, wasting hours is where classes really just go to crap and we can't have it. Really, you would prefer to close these guys before visits ever really come into play. You're not going to see that many visits scheduled from other teams before week 6, really at the absolute earliest. Visits are obviously related to their top 5 phase rather than week of the season, so it's not like it's a perfect timestamp, but in general trends, you just don't see them pop up super early on. Keeping the heat all the way up on your best prospects can land them before we'd even stand to benefit from a visit. So unless you have a ton of overage, and if you do, it's visits over scouting in a landslide, spend those 40 hours on now influence rather than later influence. I'm going to keep the hot takes coming here and let you know that I think sway falls under the same general heading as visits. You should really think of this mechanic like a Hail Mary, last ditch against all odds type of measure if you have truly no other options. Or in a 5-star type of example, it could be a way to set up a true knockout punch mega stack of influence, but it's never guaranteed to work. Real quick, sway just adds another ideal pitch to a prospect. It doesn't work all the time. It's meant to give you another set of 3 green checks if the interest that the prospect starts with don't really work for you or you don't grade well there. If sway is successful, it adds the green check marks that you picked to their already existing ideal pitch. And as it works, if you're trying to sway them to something they kind of care about to the tune of 2 out of 3 of their green check marks, there's a higher chance than trying to sway them to care about something they don't really care that much about, like a 1 out of 3 green checkmark match, or they don't care at all about with 0 out of 3. And honestly, I don't know if you could ever realistically sway a brand new pitch with 0 green check overlap. At best, it would be a really low chance roll. So for a lower end program, I've really never come across a situation where I felt like a sway would benefit me more than spending those hours to get influence now would. But the cooler application of sway is with an excess of hours and a high caliber recruiter coach. There's a potential to use sway, add a 4th or even a 5th green checkmark if you get 2 of your sways to land, set up a hard sell and a soft sell combo at the same time with your additional hours per prospect, and have both sells be on perfect pitches or 3 out of 3 green check match. Means the same thing. You'd fill out the balance of any hours you have left for the guy on other recruiting actions, and it's essentially setting up this big knockout punch of influence. But I've also honestly just found that a big setup like that generally isn't necessary for big schools who could do it, as they can just bulldoze their prospects and get commitments without it. So really, on either end of the spectrum, I don't see a whole lot of value in sway. You might have seen this coming by now, but I'm also throwing soft sells in the garbage. It allows for a lower penalty if you sell on a pitch that the prospect didn't care about or wasn't their perfect pitch. It wasn't their 3 for 3 match. So theoretically, you'd use this if you weren't certain of the guy's pitch, but you wanted to make a guess anyway. But I'd rather just spend the hours on actions that will find out that information for me and then move to a hard sell, especially with what I'm about to tell you about deducing the hard sell early. Which of this bunch of features we're talking about now in the top 5 phase is absolutely the best and most important weapon to understand as we move on to week-to-week management. Hard selling on good grades for your school is the only way you can get the hours that you spend to get you a higher value in influence gained. That is to say, outside of hard sell, it's only ever about the hours you spend on a guy as to how much influence you gain, and not the green arrows that correspond to those actions. And it feels like it should, because as we count the green arrows here on Send the House, we have 5. Contact friends and family shows us 4. DM the player shows us 3. So right away, it would seem like DMing the player and contacting friends and family would only cost us 35, but get us a value of more influence than Send the House would. It's a totally reasonable assumption to make based on the information that we're shown, but it's not actually the case. Even though it feels like it should be, influence gains always correspond to hours and are never represented by their green arrow count. Hours over arrows, always, except for hard selling on good grades. That's the only exception. So you'll want to call that in whenever you can, as early as you can. Low tier schools just aren't going to have good grades to sell on. So you're not really going to want to use sells all that frequently at all if your program is really in the mud. Better schools should absolutely move to a hard sell if they grade well on a prospect's perfect pitch. The rule of thumb, but it's not concrete, is I'm generally hard selling on 2 greens and 1 yellow grade, but not all too much less than that. Ideally, you'd prefer 3 green grades, of course, but it's not always going to work out like that. Before we move on to week-to-week management, a quick but very important note on hard selling. I gave it its own section. Hear me out. We covered this next idea at length in the very first recruiting video that we ever did on the channel, and it's probably the most valuable game knowledge in recruiting and can allow you to move on to a hard sell benefit before you actually uncover all 3 of their interests at all. That's a 15-minute video, but I'm gonna go through it as efficiently as possible here. Every prospect has one single perfect pitch, and there is no combination of interest that a prospect might have that does not match up 3 for 3 with one of the pitches we have to choose from. So that is just to say that there is always a correct answer among your 14 choices for a pitch. As soon as you see 2 green check marks, you can scroll through the available pitches to see if you can deduce which perfect pitch is theirs, and I'm going to show you this example in just a second. Find every pitch that matches the 2 green checks that you have uncovered. Sometimes there's only going to be 1 pitch that matches with those 2. So you know right then and there, even with the unidentified interest showing a question mark, that that's going to be the prospect's ideal pitch. And to see that in action, I pulled up our guy JT Cook here, and as you can see, we've only uncovered 2 of his green check interests: athletic facilities and coach stability. So now I would tap in here and start scrolling around to see which pitches match the 2 green checks that we have on the board already. College experience doesn't. No, no, no. Still no 2 match, still no 2 match, still no 2 match. And there is a 2 match. So we're going to keep that in mind. Team player is one possibility because we have a question mark next to proximity to home, but it matches the other 2 green checks. So we're going to keep team player in mind. Let's see if any other pitch matches the 2 green checks that we have. No, 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 no. Also no. More no. Still negative. Not yet. And no, so this is actually a perfect example of us deducing what absolutely must be his perfect pitch, because this is the only one that matched 2 of his interests. And it doesn't matter that we don't know about the 3rd, because this is the only answer that it possibly could be. That's how it works in practice. Other times, and this seems to be more common, you might wind up between 2 choices. But if one has a red X and the other has a question mark, you know the one with the question mark included has to be the perfect pitch, because you confirmed that it's not the other one via that red X. There is always a 3 for 3 match. Taking it even one step further, you can use this same idea on a prospect for which you've only uncovered 1 green check if they have a deal breaker that's not that same interest. Since you have the 1 green check uncovered and you know a second one based on the different deal breaker, their deal breakers will always be one of their interests, you could follow the same process of deduction using the 2 interests that you know to see if you could even get a perfect pitch on just 1 green interest. So you might be able to call your shot wildly early, but obviously that's not going to be super common. But you want to get to hard sell as early as possible, Don't wait for 3 out of 3 green check marks to be revealed if you don't have to. Use process of elimination to see what it could be, and you might already have enough information to call out the right pitch and move on to the benefit of the hard sell right then and there. You really have most of the knowledge you need to manage your board by now, so we can make this part relatively quick. You want to hammer the guys at the top of your board, which from our setup strategy will be your reach caliber players that you have a chance with, and move as far down as your hours allow you to. You can keep your pedal to the metal to push recruits' phases faster, or you could pull back on some hours if you have a comfortable lead and you could spend them on other guys in the meantime. Make your own decisions on priority in here, but turn all the way up on a relatively small number of guys. With your leftovers, if you have any, spread them across a couple of the guys lower on your board that you have pipeline advantages with, or you're still looking to be in the race for. The longer they stay with lower hours invested, the less your odds become, but we aren't meant to land all these guys anyway, so prioritize high odds players. So it's full blast on some top guys, lower spread amongst a few others, and understand that there will be guys that don't get any hours at all. Quite a few of them, especially at a growing school. Remember, we only want to land between 15 and 20 guys total, so that's just fine. We'd rather lock in our high-end studs than half-mast a bunch of prospects and not wind up landing any of them. You'll check in on your leads for your big spend prospects and decide whether you can afford to peel some hours off and spread them further down your board. Take prospects off frequently. It won't take long for you to be able to see guys that you just don't really have a good shot with. As soon as you can see that you're out of the race or that your odds are just too low to justify the spend gamble, get those hours back, get them off your board, and re-spend elsewhere. Ideally, you kind of have most of your guys before week 10. Anticipate that you'll be able to land a few transfer prospects around your base or reach star levels after the season's over, in case you come up low on numbers, but you won't have these guys for the full 5-year potential career, and you can't anticipate who's going to be in the transfer portal, so there's not much planning to be done for it. But landing transfers is actually pretty easy with this one extra trick I'm about to show you. To start to wrap things up, the transfer portal is just a speed run of a recruiting experience in just 4 weeks. You're going to have a ton of hours to spend here, so once you choose your targets with the same pipeline and relative influence eye that you've been developing since your setup phase, just full blast the guys you've added here with all the hours that you can. Visits here can be worth it because hours aren't at a premium anymore. You'll have more than you need. In week 1, though, it seems like you can't or shouldn't schedule a visit because you just don't know anything about the prospect, right? Turns out, not necessarily. Some of these guys will have a deal breaker. If they do, you know that that's one of their interests without ever finding it out. And since you only need one interest to pitch for a visit, if you have even a decent grade on their deal breaker that's not red, go ahead and schedule that week 1 visit and profit. So in this instance, our guy Charles has a deal breaker, and we could tell that in the bottom right corner of the screen. His deal breaker is playing style. So sight unseen, we can move to schedule a visit in week 1. We'll see where our playing style grade is at, and in this case it's an A. So this is absolutely a situation where we're scheduling this week 1 visit to try to upstream everybody else. Then in week 2, you'll be able to see whether you can schedule visits on guys that you couldn't already. So do so if it's a decent grade situation ASAP, and otherwise just kind of close your eyes and max out hours on your targets and see how the chips fall. It's really not usually super high stakes in the transfer portal, but you can make things easy with the deal breaker week 1 transfer cheese. I know this was a ton of information, but I told you it was going to be the most complete and comprehensive guide, and I was not lying. In the interest of summary from a high level, the process kind of goes a little like this. First, set up your board with high odds prospects using the interest column and your best pipeline tiers. Decide your reach and base caliber prospects at this stage. You can scout your guys before you offer a scholarship and consider leaving any busted gems from your reach level on the board, but you could probably go ahead and remove any of your base level busts. By the same token, you'll want to slide your gem prospects up to the top. Your board should be reflective of your priority in signing these guys, sorted by your odds. Make sure you have enough hours remaining to offer scholarships to the whole board, and you can move on from there. Then you'll manage your board week to week with the same eye for pipeline and relative influence that you've been developing since the setup. You'll want a high hour spend at the top of your board where there are the best players that you also have a high chance at landing, and you'll spread the balance, if there is any, throughout some lower ranked prospects prospects for yourself. Week to week, you'll then add or subtract hours depending on how much of a lead you do or don't have, and don't be scared to remove prospects frequently. Remember, your carrying capacity of recruits is actually only about 15 to 20 annually. Then take advantage of the hard sell as soon as you can by using that process of deduction to try to get to that benefit early. For bigger schools, visits and scouting can be a luxury, but for lower tier programs, I don't think they're the most valuable play. Same general idea on soft sells and sways, and you heard my reasoning a little earlier. Don't put too many of your eggs in the transfer portal bucket, as you can't forecast the level of talent that will be available there, but the process once you do get there is pretty easy, especially with the week 1 deal breaker visit cheese, and other than that, you can just brute force your way through this period. Then once the year is over, you'll cut your roster down to size if necessary, redshirt your freshmen wherever you can, and in a few years, you'll see your reach caliber prospects turn into your base caliber prospects. I've left some chapter markers in the description that you can pull down just below the title of the video, so you could jump around in case you want to revisit anything specifically. I'm super grateful to the College Football 25 community that we've been cultivating on this channel, and I really do hope this was a significant value add for your recruiting process. As always, drop me a comment if this helped you out, or if you have an adjustment to make. I've been Fen, y'all been great. I'll catch you next video. Peace!